Okay, I'm going to try to show you where we are now. We have finished. By the way, this is not drawn correctly. I put a little wedge in here to show where we are. We finished doing the turning of the heel, and we're at this point right here where we're now joined up back to, well, we're actually fixing to join into the foot here. So this is what's on the needles now. We're fixing to rehang the top of the foot here. Those are still just hanging out there waiting to be put back on the needles. So these stitches, the heel stitches, are hanging on the needles right now. So I'm going to show you how to calculate for your foot. You'll look at these, and I've allowed 2 inches for the heel. You can do anywhere from 1.5 inches to 2 inches for the heel and toe. And this is the middle of the wedge. I don't like to allow too much because, or not enough, because when the sock is on your foot, it's going to stretch out. So I'm going to show you the calculations that I use. It's going to depend on your yarn. It's also going to depend on how much how many needles you've held out for your heel. This heel turned out a little bit bigger, even though that there was less needles, but it's a thicker yarn also. So I like my sock to be snug, so you can experiment to see how you should do yours. So here's my foot. So when I'm saying the foot, I'm talking about from where the heel stops and the toe starts. I've allowed 2 inches for the heel and 2 inches for the toe. You can adjust that if you need to. My foot measured 9 inches. I subtracted 10% to make it a little bit more snug, and I rounded it to 8 inches. Then I subtracted the 2 plus the 2, and I come up with 4. So I'm going to knit for 4 inches in stockinette. And then what we're going to do when we get to the toe is we're going to repeat the whole heel process. When we finish knitting the foot, we're going to remove that on waste yarn and then start the short row technique for the toe, exactly the same as we did for the heel. So let's get to it. From this point on, we're going to be knitting in the round. So when I get to this point here, I'm going to have to start rehanging stitches like we did for the heel, but we won't be doing any decreasing or increasing. So here's my needle number 1. I can reset my row counter because I need to keep track of how many rounds that I did for the foot, so I can do sock number 2 exactly the same. So I'm going to clear my counter and start knitting the foot. So for this first stitch, I'm going to snug that up a little bit, and then just be careful of all these first few stitches. Make sure that they're knitting correctly, because we've done a whole lot of stuff on the heel. And I want to stop for a second to show you the cup of the heel. All that turning and adding extra columns and rows ends up making a lot more stitches on this side than on the foot side, which gives you a nice little cup for your heel. So here's number 13, which is the last stitch we rehung, and I'm going to do the same thing in the first empty needle. I'm going to let it rise up just enough to hang a stitch on it. I'm going to follow the last stitch down to my waste yarn. I've done this before and I actually skipped a whole stitch and then I had to undo everything. Pretty aggravating. But we do have our waste yarn lifeline. If you don't like the way the heel looks, or if the holes are too big or whatever, you can just rip all this out without cutting your yarn and get down to your lifeline and start the whole heel over again. You want to be happy with the sock. So here's my last stitch that's hanging off that needle. There's my waste yarn. There's the loop I need to rehang. So there might be a little bit of a gap here. So sometimes they recommend that you grab a loop from a previous column, find one that'll work. I might use that one right there, and go ahead and stretch it over and hang it on the same needle. So that might tighten up that little join right there where the heel joins with the top of the foot, and it might keep a hole from forming there. So my next empty needle is number 15. I need to let it poke up a little bit, follow the waste yarn in, grab that stitch, and hang it. And you don't have to close any more gaps at this point. We're going to work our way to the other side and close this gap too if we need to. So let me rehang all of those stitches. I'm making sure they go down around those teeth down there. Here's my blue yarn, which is my waste yarn. Okay, the last one may be a little hard to find, so just take your time and orient yourself where you are. Here's my waste yarn, and it's diving down into this stitch that's starting to curl down toward the bottom. It's not this one, it's this one that's hiding down there. Follow this waste yarn into the stitch. And there it is. And it may be a little tight because it's the last one. So remember, I closed the gap on the other side of the top of the foot. Now I need to close the gap between the heel and the foot on this side. So sometimes it's a little hard to decide which loop to use, but use one that looks like it'll help you close whatever gap is right here. And find one that you can stretch over without distorting the sock. These loops that you're pulling over are all going to be on the inside of the sock, and they won't show on the outside. So that hasn't dropped down all the way, but once that needle pops up, I'll be able to get it all the way down to the base. Okay, so now we are back to our beginning needle, which still has 2 loops on it from rehanging it before. It has not been allowed to knit yet. So we're back to the beginning. I'm just going to stop here for a second. I just want to mention that if you're not happy with the gaps left after you take this off the machine and you just really don't like the heel, you can come in from the inside with an extra piece of yarn and sew those gaps together, and you'll never be able to tell from the right side of the sock. You just want to do it in such a way that it won't make it bumpy for your foot, but it can be fixed. This is just some knotted up yarn that came off of the ball of yarn that way. So I determined that I'm going to knit 4 inches for my foot. When you're measuring your rounds, I've already knitted 1 round because I'm back to this needle. I need to put a marker of some kind so I can know where to measure from. So let me just stick a stitch marker in a couple of rows down. And when I measure, I'm going to measure from that point as I knit. And I've already knitted with this sock yarn or this yarn before, so I know it's about 20 rows. So I'm going to just knit about 15 and then measure. Just kind of go slow this first round till you see that all those stitches that you rehung are going to knit properly. And I'm watching the needles that are approaching the yarn guide so I can make sure that the loops that are on the needle drop down to the base as the needle is rising. I've done about 14 rounds, so I'm going to pull this up a little bit. So you don't want to stretch it when you measure it. So I'm just going to measure about what I've done already. And it's only about 3 inches. So I know I'm probably going to have to do at least 20 rounds. So I'm going to continue knitting until I get my 4 inches. Okay, I went past the 20. I should have stopped before the 20, but I'm going to go ahead and get back to my beginning needle. And the next sock I'm going to do 21 rounds just like I did on this one. That measures about 4 inches. So let me get back to needle number 1. It's right there. So I'm going to remove this on waste yarn just like I did for the leg of the sock. And then we're going to repeat the whole short row technique just like we did for the heel on the exact same needles using the stitch markers and the waste yarn. So I'm going to do a few rounds of waste yarn, drop this off the machine, and then we'll start rehanging for the toe. Go ahead and unthread my main yarn without cutting it. You can change colors for your toe right now if you want to. I said you could change colors for your toe, but you have to wait until after you start rehanging the sock. What I want to do right now is put my waste yarn in. So don't change colors yet, but you can, if you're going to change colors, go ahead and cut your main yarn, leave a good sized tail, and cut it. But I'm going to do a solid sock, so I'm not cutting mine. I'm just going to do some waste yarn. I'm going to use a tapestry needle to bind off my waste yarn just like I did before, so I don't have to worry about it running down. When you hear that little popping noise, that means it's dropped down all the way. Click. And I'm going to continue exact same way I did the leg. Okay, fixing to have the big reveal. Good or bad. I don't know yet either whether I did a good job. So by removing it on waste yarn does give you a chance to look at your sock, because the anticipation is killing me. So here is the leg of my sock, which I'm going to turn down like this. This is where I turn the heel, and I can see I left a stitch marker in there. But my heel looks pretty good. I thought it was going to be a little loose, but I think it's going to work. And so I still have a big hole here where I need to stitch the toe, or do the short row technique for the toe. So I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to rehang this back on the machine for the toe. And at this point I can go ahead and remove the waste yarn that I put around the leg of the sock, but because I used a tapestry needle to weave in and out of these stitches, I'm going to have to pull that out so that I can unravel that waste yarn. I want to say that I had no control over where the colors of my yarn would end up, because this is a self-striping yarn. I kind of wish that this color change would have happened on the heel, but I think that it really doesn't matter. These are socks that I'm going to wear around the house. So I'm going to take a little break, and then we're going to come back and rehang the toe onto the machine. I've rehung my toe, or the end of my foot stitches, 12 stitches on 12 needles, just like I did for the heel, and I'm going to go ahead and knit number 12, and as I come back I'm going to wrap and turn just like I did before. I'm going to pick up stitch number 13. So just go back and rewind the video up to the heel part and just repeat that whole thing over again. Now for the toe, I've decreased and I've increased back out. So all that's left to be done now is to remove these remaining stitches onto waste yarn. So I'm going to do that now so that we can graft the toe together. Okay, I'm going to thread up with waste yarn. I've cut a nice long tail of my main yarn. I'm done with it. So I need some to sew up the toe with. So I've got a little tail of the waste yarn, and these stitches are still on waste yarn, so I don't need to do anything with those. I just need to secure the stitches that are still on the needles. And it looks like I dropped a stitch right there. You would know I'd get down to the end and drop a stitch. And go forward. And I can return because that's 13 needles. Go past number 1 and back and forth for a few rows. And I am going to go ahead, cut my yarn. And drop this off of the machine. And get ready to graft the toe. So I'm not going to remove this waste yarn yet because it's still securing the top of the toe. So if you're looking at the foot, this toe is going to come up over the top. This is your little pocket for your toe, and this is going to be a seam across the top of the toe. All this waste yarn is going to be gone, and there's going to be the seam across the top of the toe. It's really hard to see with all this junk on there, but it's going to be right across here where the foot is being pulled down to the toe, and I'm pulling the toe up and around the top. Before I do any grafting, I want to show you how much better the wraps look on this tighter stitch that I did. So we're learning as we go on how tight those stitches need to be, but I think I've got the method down. It's a little bit neater here than it is on this heel.